Bantam Doubleday Dell Audio Publishing presents Vanished by Danielle Steele. Charles Delauney limped only slightly as he walked slowly up the steps of St. Patrick's Cathedral, as a bitter wind reached its icy fingers deep into his collar. It was 2 weeks before Christmas, and he had forgotten how cold it was in New York in December. It was years since he'd been back to New York, years since he'd seen his father. His father was 87 now. His mother had been gone for years. She died when he was 13, and all he could remember of her was that she had been very beautiful and very gentle. His father was senile and ill, bedridden and infirm. The attorneys had insisted that Charles come home at least for a few months to try and get the family affairs in order. He had no siblings, and the entire burden of the Delauney affairs rested on his shoulders. Land holdings throughout the state, an enormous estate near Newburgh, New York, coal, oil, steel, and some very important real estate in downtown Manhattan. A fortune that had been amassed not by Charles or even by his father, but by both of his grandfathers, and none of it interested Charles for a single moment. His face was young but weather-lined, and showed the wear of pain and battle. He had just spent almost 2 years in Spain, fighting for a cause that was not his own, but about which he cared deeply. It was one of the few things he did care about, something he truly burned for. He had joined the Lincoln Brigade to fight the fascists almost 2 years before, in February of 1937, and he'd been in Spain ever since, fighting the battle. In August, he had been wounded again near Gandesa during the Battle of Ebro, in a ferocious confrontation. It was not the first time he had been wounded. At 15, in the last year of the Great War, he had run away and joined the army and been wounded in the leg at Saint-Mihiel. His father had been furious about it then, but there was nothing he could do now. He knew nothing of the world, or his son, or the fight in Spain. He no longer even recognized Charles, and perhaps, Charles had decided as he watched him sleeping in his enormous bed, perhaps it was better this way. They would have argued and fought. He would have hated what his son had become, his ideas about freedom and liberty, his hatred of fascists. His father had always disapproved of his living abroad. Born late in his father's life, it made no sense to the elder Delauney that Charles wanted to live over there, raising hell in Europe. Charles had gone back to Europe at 18 in 1921 and had lived there for 17 years since then, working occasionally for friends or selling an occasional short story in his youth, but in recent years primarily living from his very substantial trust fund. The size of his income had always irritated him. "No normal man needs that much money to live on," he'd once confided to a close friend, and for years he'd given most of his income to charitable causes, although he still derived great pleasure from making a small sum from one of his short stories. He had studied at Oxford, and then at the Sorbonne, and finally, for a brief while, he'd gone to Florence. He'd been more than a little wild in those days, drinking as much fine Bordeaux as he could consume, an occasional absinthe, and carousing with a fascinating array of women. At 21, he had thought himself a man of the world after 3 very uncontrolled years in Europe. He had met people others only read about, did things few men dreamed, and met women others only longed for. And then there had been Marielle. But that was another story, a story he tried not to let himself think of anymore. The memory of her was still too painful. She wandered into his dreams at night sometimes, especially when he was in danger or afraid, asleep in a trench somewhere with bullets whistling past his head. And then the memory of her crept in, her face, those unforgettable eyes, her lips, and the bottomless sorrow she wore like a wound the last time he saw her. He hadn't seen her since, and that was almost 7 years before. 7 years without seeing her, touching her, holding her, or even knowing where she was, and telling himself it no longer mattered. Once, when he was wounded and convinced he would die, he had allowed himself to wallow in the memories, and the medics had found him unconscious in a pool of blood. But when he awoke, he could have sworn he saw her standing just behind them. She had been only 18 when they met in Paris. She had a face so beautiful and alive it looked as though it had been freshly painted. He had been 23, and he had seen her as he sat in a cafe with a friend. He had been taken with her instantly as he watched her, and as she glanced at him, She had a face full of mischief. She had run away then, back to her hotel, but he had seen her again at the American ambassador's dinner. They had been introduced formally, and everything had been very circumspect, except Marielle still had those laughing eyes that had bowled him over. But her parents were far less taken with him. Her father was a serious man, much older than his wife, and he knew of Charles' reputation. Her father was a contemporary of his own father's, and Charles thought they knew each other slightly. Her mother was half French, and always seemed to Charles to be incredibly proper and extremely dreary. They kept Marielle on a ridiculously short leash, and insisted that she dance attendance on them every moment. They had no idea what a flirt she was, or how funny she could be. But there was a serious side to her as well, and Charles found he could talk to her by the hour. She had been vastly amused to discover him at the embassy, and remembered seeing him at the cafe, although she didn't admit it to him until much later, when he teased her. He was fascinated by her, and she by him. To her, he was a very intriguing young man, unlike any she had ever known. She seemed to want to know everything about him, where he came from, why he was there, how he came to speak such good French. And she was impressed from the first by his ambitions and abilities as a writer. She painted a little, she'd explained to him rather shyly at first, and later, when they knew each other better, she had shown him some astoundingly good drawings. But that first night, it was neither literature nor art which appealed to either of them. It was something in their souls which drew them irrevocably together. Her parents noticed it too, and after her mother had seen them chatting with each other for a while, she attempted to pull Marielle away and introduce her to some other young people who had been invited. But Charles had followed her everywhere, a ghost who could no longer stand to be without her. They met at the Deux Magots the following afternoon, and afterward went for a long walk along the Seine, like two mischievous children. She told him everything about herself, her life, her dreams, of wanting to be an artist one day, and then marrying someone she loved and having 9 or 10 children. He was less amused by that, but fascinated by her. There was something ephemeral and delicate and wonderful about the girl, and yet underneath it something powerful and resilient and alive. She was like lace delicately placed over exquisitely carved white marble. Even her skin had the translucence of the statues he'd seen in Florence when he first arrived from the States, and her eyes shone like deep blue sapphires as she listened to how he felt about his own dreams about writing. He hoped one day to publish a collection of his short stories. She seemed to understand everything, and to care so much about all the things that mattered so deeply to him. Her parents had taken her to Deauville, and he had followed her there, and then on to Rome, Pompeii, Capri, London, and finally back to Paris. Everywhere she went, he had friends, and he would conveniently appear, and as often as possible go for long walks with her, or escort her to balls, and spend extremely boring evenings with her parents. But she was like a drug to him now, and wherever he was, wherever he went, he knew he had to have her. Absinthe had never been as fascinating as this girl, and by August, in Rome, as she looked at him, her eyes were filled with the same unbridled passion. Her parents were nervous about him, but they knew the family, after all. He was well-mannered, intelligent, and it was difficult to ignore the fact that he was the sole heir to an enormous fortune. The fortune meant nothing to Marielle. Her parents were comfortable, and it was something she never thought about. She thought only about Charles. The strength of his hands, his shoulders, his arms, the wild look in his eyes after they kissed, the chiseled beauty of his features like an ancient Greek coin, the gentleness of his hands when he touched her body. And he felt almost drunk when he was near her. The only thing he knew for sure was that he didn't want to lose her. Not now, not ever. Marielle was ecstatic when Charles proposed, but her father's response was discouraging. "Wait and see how you like him when he comes back to New York, my dear. And in the meantime, there are lots of handsome young men waiting for you there. There's no need to fall head over heels over this one." Charles and Marielle eloped 3 days before her parents were to set sail, leaving a note for them at the Hotel Crillon. They stayed in Europe waiting for their daughter to reappear, and when she did, 2 months later, they were frantic, and their hearts were anything but warm to Charles Delauney. Her father insisted on an annulment, but Marielle put that idea to rest quickly. "I can't get an annulment, Papa," she said quietly. "I'm having a baby." Marielle was sorry that her mother and father were so distraught, but at least Charles was deliriously happy with the news. Marielle's parents left shortly after that on the France, And after all the excitement and fuss and strain and exhaustion...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?